Welcome back. So for this lecture, we're going to focus on that third aspect of how we describe and understand consonant sounds in languages of the world. So to look at what we've covered so far, if we look at our vocal tract, we've looked at a lot of these different places. We've looked at the larynx, and we've talked about where things are happening in the vocal tract in order to make different sounds. And so we're looking at that third one, in addition to the voicing that we've talked about in the larynx, in addition to place, so the location that the articulators are at in the vocal tract. Manner is the third important feature that we use to describe consonant sounds of language. And previously I've mentioned that it's sort of the how of the sound. And more specifically, manner of articulation refers to the amount of restriction that's in the vocal tract when we're making a sound. So is there complete restriction? Are things relatively open? How much air can get through with that amount of restriction? So the first one that we'll talk about are nasal sounds. And nasal sounds are often misunderstood as what they're doing in terms of either place or manner. So a lot of times nasal sounds are thought of as being a place, but it's actually considered a manner of articulation. And this happens when the velum opens up to allow airflow through the nasal cavity. And when we're thinking about why these would not be a place of articulation, you may have some ideas, but the reason that these are a manner of articulation, it's referring to an amount of restriction, but also these can happen in many different places. So you're still moving your articulators into different places to make a nasal sound. So a bilabial sound like an sound sounds different than an alveolar sound like an sound, or a velar sound like our sound. But this is because even though we're letting the air out of our nasal cavity the entire time, these are happening in different places. I'm creating resonance in my oral cavity in different places that create a different sound as a result. And nasal stops are related to another of manner, which we would consider a plosive. Your book sometimes just refers to these as stops, and we'll talk a little bit why I want to make a distinction between stop and plosive. And plosives are just a complete closure of the vocal tract. So when you constrict the airflow completely in a particular place in your mouth, you've made a plosive. It's sometimes called an oral stop. And we have several of these in English. So some of the ones that we have, p, b, t, d, k, g. And you can test out what it's like to completely close off your vocal tract when you're making them. So if you make a P sound, when you're doing this, your lips are closing completely and you're holding them closed for a little bit, and then you're opening them back up in order to make the sound. Same with something like a T sound. So if you make a T sound, you're sticking your tongue up against your alveolar ridge. This is an alveolar sound. And you're holding it there for a second before you release that tongue, and then the air comes out. And so this is why we want to make a distinction between just stops in general and plosive specifically. So all stops are going to involve two different phases, the closure phase and the release phase. And with plosives, the noise that you're hearing is happening in the release phase. So if I try to close my mouth to make a P sound, nothing happens if I just close my mouth and don't do anything. The sound only happens when I open my mouth and release that air that's behind it. And so the release phase is where the sound is coming from. But nasal sounds are also a form of stop as well. And so this is where we want that distinction to come into play. So nasal sounds have continuous airflow, but the oral tract is still completely closed. You're still closing off your oral cavity completely at whatever place of articulation. And so even though these are sometimes just called nasal sounds, you might hear them referred to as nasal stops because there is still also a closure and a release phase. The difference though is that nasals have their sound during the closure phase when that resonance is happening in your oral cavity versus a plosive where it's happening in the release phase. So with the nasal sound like it only makes sound while your mouth is closed, and then when you open your mouth, the sound stops. With the plosive, it's the opposite. We're closing, there's no sound, and it's the release that makes the sound. A similar sound to plosives is what's known as a flap or a tap. And so these are related because it's made in the same kind of way. So you'll hear either flap or tap, they refer to the same kind of sound. And this is kind of like making a plosive, but rather than holding your articulators and then releasing them, it's just a very quick closure where you're just flapping your tongue in the place of articulation. So the most common one that we have in English, and the one that we'll talk about that we have in American English, is using a flap in a word like ladder or butter. So we replace D's and T's in the middle of words frequently with these flaps. So you can hear the d or t sound rather than actually holding and then releasing. You're just flapping your tongue up where you would make that sound and dropping it back down. Ara, ara, ara. And so it kind of almost sounds a little bit more D-like, but it's a different sound than a full D. So ladder versus ladder is going to give you a slightly different sound. Ara, ara. And so this ends up in American English giving us ladder as in climbing a ladder or Latter-day Saints ladder, sounding exactly the same because of that flap that we use. The flap is also the sound, if any of you speak Spanish, that the single R makes in Spanish. So in a word like para, pero, arena, it's not like the English R, it's actually this flap sound, ara, ara, that you're hearing in place of the single R in Spanish. The next one that we'll talk about manner of articulation is known as a fricative. And this is where our active and passive articulators get very close to each other, but they're not quite touching. So with all of the stops that we've had in the flaps, we're touching our articulators together in some way. With fricatives, we're not quite getting there, but they're getting very, very close. And so this creates a fricative. And so it sounds kind of like the word friction. That might help you remember. And it's because of that friction that we have the kind of sound that we have. It's coming from that turbulence of the air coming through a very small opening. And these are very common sounds in languages of the world. English has tons of them as well. So sounds like our F and our V and our TH sounds, our S, our Z sounds, Z, are all different examples of the kinds of fricatives that we have. And so you can see the minute difference in making these sounds if you compare a plosive with a fricative. So if I make a T sound, t, t, and then I also make an S sound, you may notice that your tongue is in almost the exact same place. The tip is just flattening out a little bit. And there's a very, very small opening for the sound to come through with an S sound. And you can feel that vibration. It kind of tickles a little bit against your tongue when you're making an S sound. And it's because of that vibration, that really small amount of air or the small amount of space that the air can move through, that you're getting that fricative sound. Now, we've talked about plosives, we've talked about fricatives, and the next one we'll talk about is actually a combination of them. So affricates are actually two different sounds that we produce so quickly that it takes the time of a single sound, and most speakers often perceive them as a single sound, even though it's actually two different sounds combined in a very quick time frame. And these are always language specific. So we'll focus on the ones that we have in English, and then I'll give you a few examples of some ones that are common in other languages as well. But in English, we have two. We have our ch and our j sound. And you'll notice that, again, spelling is not going to be helpful. And in the next lectures, we'll see how we can sort of work out the spelling issue. But how we would typically think of a CH sound versus a J sound, our ch and j sounds, are actually affricates. They're actually two different sounds together. So the first and last sound in the word church, the first and last sound in the word judge would be the voiceless church and voiced judge versions of them. And what we're actually doing is taking our alveolar plosives, a T sound in church, and then mixing it with our fricative sound sh, putting those together very quickly, and then we get ch, t, sh, ch. And you can feel your tongue moving between those sounds as you're making them. The same thing is happening with judge, except with our voiced sounds. So we have our d sound in the beginning, and then we have our j sound coming after. D, j, j, j. And so this is just a voice version of that, but you can again feel your mouth moving very similarly. And in English, we consider both of these sounds to be post-alveolar sounds in terms of their place, because you're starting with an alveolar sound, but you're moving backwards towards that post-alveolar area. So it's the destination that we're using to describe this. So these would both be considered post-alveolar. Now, as I mentioned, these are language specific, and they are going to vary from language to language. So there's some that we don't have in English that other languages frequently use, and these are always going to have some sort of plosive and then some sort of fricative afterwards. And there's lots of others that could happen in other languages. So one that's very common in several languages and that we've borrowed into English in a couple of examples is the ts sound. So for example, from Italian, we've borrowed words like pizza, which has that affricate in it, even in English, because we've borrowed the word. So we don't say pizza or pizza, we use that affricate the same as the Italian original would use that. So we have pizza. Another common one is taking the P and F sounds. So in German, they use this as an affricate. So in a word like Pfand or Pfeffer, where you're taking both of those and squishing them together very quickly. Sometimes English learners of German will just drop the P and say the F itself because it's more difficult and it's not as natural for us to think of that as an affricate, but it is actually just one sound put together like that. And then in the Tswana language spoken in Botswana in Southern Africa, they have one that is a T and then a lateral fricative that we don't have in English. So this ends up sounding like so in their word tlala, then you have that lateral fricative where the air is coming out of the side of your mouth, combining with that T sound. Now with these fricatives and affricates, there is a subset of them that sort of behave a little times. And these are known as either sibilant or strident sounds. Both terms refer to the same thing. So this would be a subset of fricatives and affricates. And these are the sounds where the air is directed towards the back of your teeth. So these sometimes do their own kind of thing, and they sometimes act a little different. It's not just one single manner that we're talking about. It's actually either fricatives or affricates. But because of the way that they're made, they sometimes work together as a group. So these include our English fricatives such as our S and our Z and our sh and our zh sounds, and then both of our affricates as well. And so when you try to hear the difference between these, you might test out making one of the sibilant sounds versus something that's not a sibilant sound. So if I make an S or a sh sound, sh, and compare that with an H or an F sound, you may notice that you can hear the S and the sh much, much easier. And part of that reason is that these sibilants, when they're hitting the back of the teeth, create a very high frequency sound that's much louder and much higher frequency than other sounds that we make in languages of the world. So when we're making an H or an F sound, that friction isn't as loud and it isn't as powerful with where that sound is being made. But when we're pushing the air against the back of our teeth and the air has to go through our teeth like that, it creates this very high frequency sound. So there's a reason we tell people to shh when people are being loud, because that's the higher frequency sound, and it'll be heard over other sounds that are being made, whereas something like f is not really going to be heard as easily because of its lower frequency. The last thing about are approximants. So approximants, you'll notice there's an N in that word, but it sounds about the same as the word approximate, and for a good reason, because this is where we narrow the vocal tract slightly, but not really enough to cause a lot of obstruction or noise. So you can think of this as approximate or sort of, it's a partial closure. And we have a few of these in English as well. So in English, our sounds that we frequently spell with L, W, R, or Y would be examples of approximants. So our ul, our w, our and our y sounds would be examples of approximants. And these are separated in two different kinds of ways. So if we think just in terms of how they're produced in the mouth and where they're produced in the mouth, then our approximants are separated into either central or lateral based on how they're produced. So central just means that the air is coming out of the center of your mouth. Lateral means the air is coming out of the sides of your mouth. And so most of our approximants in English are central approximants. They come out of the center of our mouth. But an L sound is actually a lateral approximant. So the air is actually escaping out of the sides of your mouth with that one. But we also have another way to separate and describe different approximants based more on what they're doing and how they're moving in our mouth. And so you'll frequently hear these, rather than just hearing them called approximants, hear them referred to as either a glide or a liquid. So we have two of each. We have two glides, we have two liquids. So our y sound in a word like yellow, our w sound in a word like water, would be similar types of approximants. We sometimes call these semi-vowels. And these are what we would call glides. So these are both central approximants. And even though they have slightly different places, so our w sound is that labiovelar one, our y sound is the palatal one, these both move around in our mouth, and they are made in similar places to other vowels that we'll talk about in the next couple of lectures. And so because of that, because they kind of act like vowels sometimes, because you can feel that movement in your mouth as you're making them, we call them glides. The other two are R and our L sounds. These are both alveolar sounds. One is central, one is lateral. And you can see the difference when you're making them. So if you make an L sound, ol, You may notice that your tongue is actually pushing up against your teeth or against your alveolar ridge, and then the air is coming out of the side of your mouth. But if you're making an R sound, also an approximant, you're sort of doing the opposite with your tongue. You're sort of curling your tongue, and the tip of your tongue isn't very close to your alveolar ridge. It's sort of just lower down from there. So you're kind of curling your tongue up on the edges. The air is coming out of the center. But these are both known as liquid sounds because they're made very differently depending on the sounds that they're next to. There's a lot of variation in how they're made, but we're still able to interpret them as an or an ol sound, even when they're next to other sounds. But because of that liquidity, because they're not as easy to pinpoint a location for, we call these sounds liquids. And these can be difficult sounds to learn. And our English R sound is actually not that common in languages of the world because it can be a more difficult sound. Manners that we have in English. We have nasals, where you're closing off your oral cavity, but you're opening up your nasal cavity to make that sound. We have plosives, where you're also closing off your oral cavity, but then it's the release phase that makes the sound. Our flap, which is kind of like a plosive, but rather than holding and releasing, you're just flapping your tongue up and dropping it. Our fricative sounds, where you have just a little bit of air escaping through and it creates that friction and that turbulence that makes the noise. Affricates, which are that combination of plosive and fricative, and then the sibilants, which are that subset of fricatives and affricates. And then finally, we have our approximants, which can be described either as central or lateral, or as either liquid or glide. So those are all of the ones we have in English. Those are the ones you should be familiar with. We've now covered all of the different terms that you'll need to know to be familiar with all of the sounds that we have in English. But before we end, I do want to show a few other manners of articulation, and some of these are going to become important as we look at other languages throughout the course of the semester as well. So the first one I want to talk about are known as trills. So trills are similar to a tap or a flap, but rather than just tapping it up once and dropping it, you're actually going to rattle the articulators together very quickly. So you're going to tap it back and forth over and over again. And these can happen in many places of articulation, but the most common one that you've probably been aware of is the alveolar one, which is the double R sound in Spanish. So when people talk about rolling your R's in Spanish, they're actually referring to this trill sound. So in a word like perro or roja, you're vibrating your tongue very quickly against the alveolar ridge of your mouth. So I can play this for you to get a better And then another common one that we find in a lot of Indo-European languages is the uvular trill. So this is an R sound in some languages. So in Dutch, the word red, or in Swedish, the word räv for fox, would give you an example of that uvular trill, where you're sort of vibrating the upper part of your throat, that in that uvular area. And so sometimes English speakers, when they're speaking Spanish or learning Spanish, might actually make a uvular trill instead of an alveolar one, because it's a little bit easier for us to make when we're trying that out. Sometimes those alveolar ones can be very difficult for native English speakers to get. But these ones will be seen in other languages from time to time. That Spanish one I'll want you to think about and hold on to as we move into talking about stuff in the next couple lectures as well. And then the last kinds of sounds we'll talk about, everything we've seen so far in English has been sounds that we need our lungs for. We breathe out, and as we're breathing out, the air is making sounds based on voicing, based on where we're putting articulators, based on the kinds of manner we're using. But there are languages of the world that don't actually use your lungs. We don't have any of them in English, but these ones, there's a few different kinds of sounds. Ejectives are the most similar. You are still breathing air out of your mouth in order to make an ejective. But rather than just breathing out and making a sound, you're sort of closing off the air twice. You're creating a little pocket of air in your vocal tract. And then you're releasing that when you release the plosive that you're making. So these are voiceless sounds. And these are most common in a lot of Native American languages. I am terrible at making them. So the examples I'm going to play for you are from a Lakota person who's speaking the actual words that you see on the screen. So listen for the pop sound that you're going to hear when you're listening to these sounds. Oh. Oh. So you notice that it kind of has that pause and that pop sound. And that's that bubble of air, that pocket of air that you're creating in order to release the sound. Touché. 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 Ooh. Ooh. So in each of these cases, you can hear that pocket and it sort of creates this pop kind of sound. The next one that we'll look at, implosives, is actually a sound that you're making by breathing in rather than breathing out. So we're used to breathing out and making sounds, but when you breathe in, you can make sounds as well. So these are found in several Bantu languages. So Zulu is an example where the word for father, ubaba, would happen with breathing in a B sound rather than breathing it out. Or the word ukuza, where you're breathing in, it's spelled with a K in Zulu, but it sounds more like a G sound. So these are typically voiced similar to plosive sounds, but they're implosive because you're breathing in rather than breathing out. So this is what the implosive B sounds like. Ba, 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 or the G. Ga, ga, ga. So rather than breathing out to make the sound, you're breathing in. It almost sounds kind of like you're swallowing the sound because of that breathing in of those noises. And then the I talk about are not of the non-pulmonic sounds, the ones you don't need your lungs for, are clicks. So these are my favorite sounds of languages of the world. And natively, only the group of Kosian languages spoken in parts of Africa natively have clicks, but many other languages have them now. Bantu languages, including Zulu and Xhosa, have adopted them into their language as well. And so there's a few different examples that I'll show you. There's many, many different kinds of clicks. This is just some of the more common ones. So in the name of the language itself, Xhosa, you have an example of the lateral click. And this click is similar to the sound that you would make if you're calling a horse. So it's kind of a side sound where you're sticking your tongue up to make a click and the air is escaping out of the side of your mouth. And then we have an alveolar click, which is in the Xhosa word start. So tala would be an example of using that one. And this is also that pop sound that you might hear drag queens use sometimes, or the sort of the sassy response that you get out of it. That's an alveolar click that you're making when you're doing that kind of sound. And then the last example from Zulu, mhwadi, is the word for book, and the sound where the letter C is the example of a dental click. So this is the sound that you might hear someone make if they're tisking you. So you're sticking your tongue up against the back of your teeth in order to make this sound. And even though we have some social examples of these in English, they're not used in the same way that they are in actual language. So we can make these in isolation relatively easily, but trying to include them into language itself can be a little bit difficult. So I'm going to play a little clip for you, and hopefully this will work, showing an example from Miriam Makeba, who is a Xhosa language singer. And this is sort of famously known as the click song because there are several clicks that are involved. So I'll play that quickly for you, and then we'll sort of wrap up and talk about what these last few lectures. So that gives you an idea of the kinds of ways that you can hear these clicks happening when they're actually spoken within language and sort of transitioning between these sounds that we do use our lungs for and these other sounds that we don't. So to sort of sum up everything from these last few lectures, we've looked at all of the major features of consonant sounds of languages of the world. So we have voicing, this is the first one. So whether our vocal folds are vibrating or not, gives us either a voiced or a voiceless sound. We have our place, so where our articulators are located in the oral tract in order to make noise sounds. So things like bilabials, labiodental, interdental, alveolar, all of those examples that we looked at the individual sounds for. And then finally, manner, what we've talked about in this lecture, referring to the amount of restriction. So whether it's complete restriction with a plosive or a nasal, a lot of restriction but not complete closure with something like a fricative, or less restriction with something like an approximant. And these are the three major things that we need in order to describe consonant sounds in languages of the world. And conventionally, most linguists will talk about them in that order. So voicing, then place, then manner. So a B sound would be a voiced bilabial plosive, or an S sound would be a voiceless alveolar fricative. As long as you have all three of those, it doesn't really matter what order they're in, but that's typically the order you'll see them in your book. It's typically what you'll hear me describe them as. But as long as you have all three of those, that's the most important aspect. Now that we've covered consonant sounds, if you do have any questions, please send me an email, schedule office hours using the office hours link, or bring questions to class, and I'm happy to talk through anything that you might have questions about. We can make the sounds, we can practice sounds, you can ask questions about it if anything wasn't clear. Again, even though there is a lot of lexicon, a lot of things to learn in these lectures, we will have a chance to practice and use this over and over again. So bring your questions to class or email them to me. We'll be able to talk about it and then move on to continuing to talk about sounds of language.